Thank you for coming to this really exciting event on the Africa's untapped and expanding business potential and how to harness it. I think there's still a couple of chairs that are opened up here for those in the back if you'd like to come forward and sit down. So in terms of the flow, we're going to start with a presentation of the highlights from the book on Africa's business revolution and how to succeed in the world's next big growth market by Dr. Asha Lika. And then there'll be a short 1 to 2 minute video, and then we'll then move to a moderated discussion. And I will make sure to have enough time at the end so you can weigh in on the conversation. And courtesy of Asha and his co-authors, there will be complimentary copies of the book at the end of the event that he's going to autograph. And that's going to be at the registration when you checked in, where you checked in. He's going to be seated there and then autograph it for you, your own special copy. All right, so by way of introduction, Dr. Asha Lika is a chairman and senior partner of McKinsey of the Africa region. He started out in Atlanta in '99, but then in 2002, he decided that he's going to move back to Africa and to help the company expand on the continent. And since then, he's worked in more than over 20 countries. In terms of the specific areas he covered, has been ranged from servicing government, multinational organization, private sector institutions across Africa on issues of economic development, tax administration, growth strategies, holistic transformation, and investment decisions. And he's obviously very accomplished, and his various recognitions includes World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. He's also a member of a few advisory councils, including the World Economic Forum's Council on Economic Growth and Social Inclusion, One Africa, the Lagos Business School, and he's also a member of the Reform Steering Committee of President Paul Kagame of Rwanda. It is often said that Asha has two jobs. He has a 9 to 5, like the rest of us, but then he had a 5 to 9 p.m. Very generous with his time and devoting it to really important initiatives on the continent. Namely, he co-founded and continues to help initiatives such as the African Leadership Academy and the African Leadership Network. You will remember in January when we launched here Foresight Africa, our flagship publication, the theme for the year was leadership, and how we emphasize that development begins and ends with good leadership. So very much, thank you very much, Asha, for this and for really building the continent's next leaders. And Asha has also been characterized as the most sought-after man on business matters in Africa. And you get to hear from him today on why Africa is the next growth market and some strategies to capitalize on the opportunities. And you get all of this for free. Under other circumstances, I cannot guarantee that. So without further ado, please join me and welcome Asha to the podium.
There we go. Thanks, cool, for the introduction. Hello, everybody. You guys here tend to, at least on the continent, we respond when the, hello, everybody. Oh, there we go. I feel more welcome here. So thanks for coming. And for us, this for me is less of a book launch. It's more of a conversation we'd love to have about business in Africa. And it's great to see some people who were with us just a few hours ago at the chamber. But the reason we want to do this is because, when I was thinking about growing up, and many of us sort of spent time in the village, and our grandparents used to tell us all these stories about the continent, and writing this book, and it was sort of a 2.5-year process, enabled us to start to reflect on these stories, right? And and ask ourselves, why don't we write the tale of business in Africa, right? And that's what we wanted to do through the book. And the tale starts with, for us, the global media, and looking at how the global media portrays Africa. And we always had an issue with it, right? Because it tends to be always about, we say three things. It's always about, either conflict or crisis or corruption, right? This is just 1 week. We just looked at the New York Times over a 1 week period to see what stories they wrote about Africa. And they wrote 5 stories, right? There was one that was about Boko Haram, right, in Nigeria. There was one that was about the migrants trying to cross to get to Europe. There were 2 stories on corruption in Angola and in Tunisia, and there was one on violence in the DRC. And those are important stories to be told, because those are some of the realities of the continent. But we think there's a whole different side to the continent that is not told enough. It's a story of Africa being more prosperous, right? This is just GDP on the continent, and you can see over the last 20 years, it's literally tripled. It's over $2 trillion. It's a story of, poverty reducing, right? We've lifted 50 million Africans out of poverty over the last years. It's a story of maternal infant mortality decreasing by over 50%, infant mortality decrease. And it's a story of improving Africa being more educated, right? If you look at literacy rates, we're at 65%. For youth literacy rate is 70%. Many countries are over 90%. And so, we wrote this book to recast the story of Africa and talk more about the progress, recognizing some of the challenges, but talk more about the progress of the continent. And that's really why we wrote this book. And to start, we started first talking about or reflecting on and analyzing what are the real trends that are shaping the continent today. And we identified 5, and in good South Africa fashion, we call them the big 5, right? So we talk about those and then talk about the strategies. The first is the consumer. I think everybody knows about the consumer story. It's been told a lot. Young, fast-growing, and urbanizing. And I always say each of these words is actually quite important, right? So it's young. Half of all Africans, as we know, are under the age of 20, which is massive. You think of the growth over the next, if you're a consumer goods company, the growth over the next 50 years. I always say there are more children born in Nigeria every year than in the whole of Western Europe. So if you're a diaper company, where do you want to be based? It's fast growing. And today we're about 1.2 billion Africans. 1 out of 6 citizens of the world is African. By 2050, it's going to double to 2.5 billion. So 1 out of 4 citizens will be Africans. By the turn of the century, it's going to get to 4 billion. 1 out of 3 will be African. So a third of the world would be African. And this is in an aging world, right? So again, think of the opportunities. There's some risks that it creates, but think of the opportunities that creates. And it's urbanizing. The average, Africa is one of the fastest urbanizing regions in the world. Every year, 24 million Africans move to cities, 24 million every year. The average GDP per capita in the cities is twice the national average, right? And I know you spent time with Tidjane Thiam, the Ivorian-born CEO of Credit Suisse, to interview him for the book. He reminded us that, and he saw this trend in Asia when he was leading Prudential. So when you take population growth and you combine it with growth in disposable income, what you get is an exponential growth in demand, right? So exponential growth in demand, and that's what we're seeing in Africa today. So that's on the consumer. Second is on industrial revolution, right? This demand and these products that the African consumer needs, somebody has to produce them. And the good news is that more and more of these products are being produced locally. We still have a long way to go, but more and more are being produced locally. It took really a bottom-up exercise to understand how much we actually manufacture on the continent today. It turns out we manufacture $500 billion worth of products every year. About 70% of that is manufactured in-country for local consumption. 10% is manufactured in-country and exported across the rest of Africa, which ties a bit closely with the 12% intra-Africa trade. About 20% is manufactured in country and exported across for the rest of the world. We project that this can grow to $1 trillion over the next few years. 75% of which will be to meet local demand, right? Again, the demand you saw on the previous page on the local consumer, right? So again, huge efforts. That's about tripling the historic growth rate on the manufacturing sector. That's again tripling that growth rate, and a lot of both government and private sector players are very actively working at that, right? So we have some people from Ethiopia here, at the Hawassa Industrial Park. There's a ton going on there, but he's excited about that. It has helped to contribute to manufacturing exports out of Ethiopia increasing 7x over the last 10 years. We have the Tangier Automotive City, and all of these, we highlight them in the book, where Renault on its own is already producing 300,000 cars, right? And the many more of these special economic zones that are starting to function well on the continent. So again, quite a bit of progress on that front. Third trend, infrastructure. This is again an area where we've lagged the rest of the world, as you know, for a long time, right? Across every asset class you can think of, whether it's energy, whether it's road, whether it's rail, we're lagging. Now, the flip side, 20, 30 years ago, we used to spend $40 billion on infrastructure in Africa every year, $40 billion. Today, we're spending about $70 to $80 billion a year. It's still short of the $150 billion a year that we project is needed across the continent, but we made just some progress. And again, here is where, as the work we do on the continent, you can see governments and the private sector and development partners being very, very serious about addressing this, right? You just take energy, for example. As we know, 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity today. We take, one company, M-Kopa, and we spend quite a bit of time interviewing them, and we highlight them in the book. They've, in the last few years, have been able to connect 600,000 households to electricity, right? And the many such companies that are starting to exist in Africa using solar home systems and innovative technologies to connect households. So again, the trend is positive. Resources. Africa has always been home to tremendous natural resources, again, across all the sectors. You take agriculture, for example. And as we know, we have 60% of the unused arable land in the world. Sarah, I'm sure, is going to talk to us about that. But again, what's exciting here is you find companies like Babangana, a startup in Nigeria that works with smallholder farmers. They've worked with 20,000 smallholder farmers in northern Nigeria, by the way. They were able to increase yields, double yields, and increase disposable incomes with these farmers 3.5 times. And their goal is to expand to a million farmers over the next few years, right? Again, another company that we spend time understanding and highlighting. You move to oil and gas, and as you know, we are home to vast reserves of oil and gas around the world. We spent time with the CEO of ENI, and he talked to us about the Rovuma Basin in Mozambique. That has enough gas to power both Germany, the UK, Italy, and France, for 20 years, right? And, ENI is leading the development. But, what he's excited about is not just doing that to export, but also using the gas for local consumption, right? He reminded us that Africa is home to 15% of the world's population, but only 3 to 4% of the world's energy, right? So again, a lot going on in that space. You look at mining, and across different commodities, we have the largest reserves in the world, right? Across diamonds, cobalt, gold, manganese, you name it, the largest reserve in the world. So again, on the resources front, you're seeing a concerted effort of all the different players to come together to help unlock these resources for the benefit of the countries. And then finally, technology. Technology is fundamentally transforming lives on the continent. We saw that first with the mobile phone, right? And today we have 300 million mobile phone connections in Africa, 40% of which are on smartphones, right? So you can imagine the power of the internet, how we can leverage the internet. We then saw that transform the financial services sector, right? Many people don't know that today, of all the mobile money accounts in the world, more than half are in Africa, right? Allowing it to leapfrog and bring financial services to the unbanked. And you look at Equity Bank, again, we spent a lot of time with James Mwangi and really studying Equity Bank. And he will tell you today that 97% of the transactions are outside of a branch. They have 12 million customers today, but 97% of the transactions don't happen in the branch today, right? So again, technology is fundamentally transforming the financial services sector. And then all of the sectors, we see it transforming agriculture, we see it transforming health, we see it transforming education, we transforming retail. And we actually project that, that if we really harness the power of the internet, that could contribute about $300 billion to Africa by 2025. And that's roughly the size of South Africa, right? So that's the impact the internet could have on the continent. Those are the big five. And so companies came to us and said, okay, fine, you know what, yes, we see these trends, but how do you then translate these trends into building a profitable and sustainable business in Africa? How do you do that, right? And that's really the reason we wrote this book. That's really to really learn how to do it and figure out how we can distill that. And the way we went about it is we started with the over 3,000 projects that McKinsey has done in Africa over the last 20, 30 years. We then built on the reports. As many of you, we've published a number of reports in the last 8 years, the Lions of the Move series of reports, some country reports on South Africa and Nigeria. We had some sector reports around technology, around energy. We had a report on women in Africa, how to harness the power of women on the continent. So we really leveraged all of our learnings from those reports. We studied 20 companies in detail, right? 20 of the winning companies across Africa. We surveyed 1,000 global executives, right, to really understand how they view the continent, what the experience has been, and how they view the continent. But for us, actually, more importantly, we then interviewed and spent really in-depth interviews with over 40 business CEOs, senior executives, and development leaders on the continent, right? Everybody from an Aliko Dangote to a Graça Machel, from Paul Collier at Oxford to Tony Elumelu. We spent time with Graça Machel. We spent time with Akin Adesina at the African Development Bank with his predecessor Donald Kaberuka. We also wanted to make sure we learned from entrepreneurs, right? So we spent time with Sarah, and you're going to hear from her today about what her experience with Grow Intelligent. Spent time with Fred Swaniker, with what he's built with Tayo Vioso's building Paga, one of the largest mobile payments companies in Nigeria, and really try to distill everything we learned from them into what it takes to build a winning business on the continent. And from all of that, we found really four essential practices. But at the heart of it was really this whole notion of doing well by doing good, of really making a difference on the continent. So let me share quickly each of these with you, and then we can engage in a discussion. First is, where do you want to play, right? And here, I always say, you can either decide to focus on one country, right, like Paga is doing in Nigeria, right? You decide to focus on one region, like Moduji is doing with metal across sort of East and Southern Africa. You can decide to expand across, the continent, like you see an MTN or a Saham and Sanlam, a combination of Saham and Sanlam. Or you can decide I want to blanket the entire continent, right? Like Coke said, right? They want to have a Coke anywhere in the world, anywhere you are in Africa. We want to make sure you can access Coke, right? But whatever you decide to do, you need to be very clear on what is your aspiration. You need to be very clear on which countries you want to prioritize. Even though Coke is in all these countries, they clearly prioritized 10 countries. Said those are the countries we're going to prioritize and really go deep in. And by the way, in some cases, it's actually not prioritizing countries. We believe it's prioritizing cities, right? Think cities, not countries. You need to be clear on how you're going to achieve scale in these markets, especially if you're going to be some of the smaller markets. You want to make sure you're a dominant player in those markets. And you need to figure out who you're going to work with, right? And that's what it takes. But at the end of the day, to build, and we studied this quite intensely, if you want to build a really meaningful business in Africa, if you want to build $1 billion or more business in Africa, it's very hard to do that if you're not in either Nigeria, Egypt, or South Africa. Very, very difficult. So that's on where to play. Now, in terms of, how do you then do it? Our book is then full of a number of companies that have innovated, whether it's on the products and services side, whether it's on the business model, right? Done things quite an innovative way. We were actually so blown away by all the innovations we uncovered as we were doing the research for the book that we wrote an article on 6 innovations from Africa that we believe the world should know about. And we just published that in Harvard Business Review a few weeks ago. I encourage you guys to read it if you're interested in it. And I'll give you an example of Indomie, right? Indomie is, it's a noodles company. They came out of Asia. They came into Nigeria 30 years ago when Nigerians honestly didn't know what noodles, tasted noodles. And they've probably become the most successful consumer brands company in Nigeria, right? And they've done that by innovating in multiple areas, right? So first on the sales and distribution, they found a way to get to the most remote areas of the country, where they'll start with trucks and then they'll go into smaller trucks and then to wheelbarrows, and where that stops, people will go by foot, right? And they really get into most remote areas. It's such a good, again, they're a consumer goods company, right? But they did such a great job of innovating on the sales and distribution that they spun off just the sales and distribution side of the business and sold half of it to Kellogg, the US company, for $450 million 3 years ago, right? And Kellogg, as they were looking to come into the continent, they said, look, you know what? We're not going to go and reinvent sales and distribution of these channels, right? Let's just leverage this distribution channel and put our products on top of it, right? They then did such a good job of innovating on the food manufacturing business itself, right? Finding the right taste that will suit the Nigerian palate. That even there, Kellogg got excited and paid another $420 million this year for a piece of the food business, right? So that's and we've seen so many of these. Equity Bank is another example of these innovative companies. But throughout the book, we were actually quite impressed and amazed by the amount of innovation we're seeing companies do to win on the continent. Third is resilience, right? How do you then build resilience? We tend to be quite positive about the book, and that's a bit the feedback we've gotten. But we recognize that doing business in Africa is not easy, right? But what we found is that the winning companies have consciously found a way to build resilience in the business model. So we spend a lot of time with Aliko to understand, everybody knows about the Dangote story. We wanted to get really below the surface, what do you do to really be so successful? And he spent quite a time just talking to us about how he built resilience in his business model, right? How he decided to diversify, not just across countries, right? Because we think that's important, but also across services, right? So from sugar and salt to flour, then to cement, now to petrochemicals. Because again, he says none of these sectors would always, be good on the continent. And I remember, one of my clients, the downstream oil and gas company, and they used to tell me, look, we're in 30 countries in Africa. Every year, 5 will blow up, right? We don't know which 5 those will be, but 25 will do well and will do very well, right? And for 40 years, they've done very well. So this whole diversification point is very important. He also, Aliko, thought really hard about what part of the value chain does he need to control, more so than you would, in more developed markets, right? So how much of his raw materials does he actually need to control? It was very clear to him providing power to his plants is critical, right? You can't count on somebody else doing that for you, right? In places like Nigeria, he owns 10,000 trucks, right? Because distributing these products was absolutely critical for him to control the distribution, right? So, he's sitting down, he's like a logistics provider with 10,000 trucks that they need to learn how to, manage. But really think about very carefully which parts of your value chain you're going to control. He spends a lot of time thinking about how to engage the different stakeholders, right? And, InterSwitch is another sort of payments company in Nigeria. We interviewed the CEO, Mitchell. And, he told us, and you'll see in the book, he told us about how what keeps him awake at night is not his competitors, is the regulators, right? And how do you make sure you influence them and make sure they do the right things? And, we've seen what has happened in, like for MTN, for example, in Nigeria, right, with some of the issues they face. So really thinking about how do you influence and have a seat at the table with the key decision makers is hugely important. But above all, what we learned from every single person we talked to on the business model is really what's critical to build resilience is about taking a long-term view. Right, it's about it's 54 countries, you're gonna have shocks here and there, but what's important is really to be able to weather the storms and take a long-term view. And our research shows that we studied all these multinationals across the continent, and we found that the ones that perform the best are the ones who've been around the longest and the ones who've been diversified across more countries. Right, that's really what it's taken for these guys for multinationals to perform across Africa. And then finally, you can't do any of this without the talent. Right, and as my friend Fred Swanik always talks about 6,000 days, right? 6,000 days. In 6,000 days, we will have more citizens of working age than China and India across Africa, right? And so for businesses, is how do you nurture and develop that talent? And in the book, you'll hear, remarkable stories of very amazing women who are doing exactly that, right? You'll hear from Stella, who's a young 22-year-old Kenyan who worked as an assistant branch manager for Subway in Nairobi. And she's a graduate of Generation, which is a program we started as McKinsey to really place these young graduates into jobs. This program has placed 10,000 young Kenyans in jobs across 180 companies. But we found a number of other such vocational training programs that are scaling up across the continent. Harambe is one that started in South Africa, also scaling up across the continent. And many companies are realizing that they need to create these programs internally to train the incoming staff. You'll read about Nadia Feta, who is the CEO of Saham Finance, right? Saham was a small insurer in Morocco, and she really drove the expansion of this business across primarily Francophone Africa, and then the merger with Sanlam that came from South Africa and was expanding north. For that, she won African CEO of the Year in last year, the Africa CEO Forum. And when we spent time with her, she told us how she spends a third of her time on developing talent, a whole third of her time. That's what she does, developing talent. She also told us that they have a rule at Saham that the deputy CEO of a local operation cannot become the next country CEO. To become the next country CEO, you have to move to a different country, right? And that's really how they promote professional growth and development within the group, right? You'll hear from Sispum Zile, who's the executive director of UN Women and used to be deputy president of South Africa. And again, she spent her time telling us how, she's made it her mission to fight what she calls the broken ladder of women's advancement in business, right? And our research shows that, right? Women account for 40% of middle management across Africa today, but only 5% of CEOs. And we have shown around the world, it's true, and we also show that in Africa, that companies that have more women on the board or on the exco perform up to 20% better than if they didn't, right? So it's very clear. So as a business, if you really want to, leverage your full potential, you have to find a way to make gender diversity a priority for you. So again, as we did all this research, we realized, none of these things are rocket science, right? You say, these 4 practices are not rocket science. But companies that win, and we studied, real in-depth a number of these, we found do 2 things. One is they're very diligent in working on all of these 15 practices. They don't get all of them right, but really they get to that granularity. And they're working hard across all of these 15 practices. And the second is that at the center of it, they have an ethos of, they're here in Africa. They're not just here to make money. They're actually here to make a difference, right? They need to make money for the shareholders, but they're here to make a difference. They're here to provide energy or electricity. People who don't have it. They're here to provide financial services products to the people who need it the most. They're here to provide affordable consumer goods and good quality consumer goods products. And they recognize that if they do that, they will make money, right? And they do, right? And they do it very well. We identified today the 440 companies that have revenues of $1 billion or more in Africa today, up from last time when we did the first analysis, we found 400. We've gone up to 440. And these companies tend to grow faster and are much more profitable on a local currency basis than the global peers on the continent. So, so they do it that well. But what they do is they come at it from a mindset of making a difference. And the reason it works for them is because, they weather the storms. Inevitably, it's 54 countries. You're always going to have some of these challenges. And if you have a short-term mindset, after 2 years of losing money, you're going to leave, right? But those who really hang in there and find a way to weather the storm because they know that the prize is bigger than just making money. The prize is actually transforming people's lives on the continent. Those are the ones that are winning, and those are the ones that have been very successful so far. So to conclude, I'll just say, you asked us about this baobab and why we try to use that. Because, for us, the baobab on the continent is really a symbol of a tree of life. And we think of these business baobabs, these large companies on the continent as companies that enliven the communities as well. They provide jobs, they provide tax revenue for governments, they provide innovation, which is much, much needed. And so we think, there's a huge need for having many more of these business baobabs, for having a tree of these business baobabs, and we hope that through this book we're going to contribute to growing that forest. And before we end, I'll just then, I don't know, I'm supposed to show a video so you can hear the voices of the people who we interviewed. Or maybe we'll do that at the end. I'm not sure where the video is. Oh, there it is.
In Africa allows the opportunity to test and experiment as well, to innovate. Go below the surface of all the negatives you read about the continent, and there's so many positive stories about Africa, positive things happening. You know, I know 20 years ago, cell phone companies thought there was no money in Africa. And of course, that's been proven untrue because they met a real basic need. And people fund the resources, fund the money.
You have an incredibly dynamic business environment where people just, with very little, get going and create value. So if you have that kind of population where you have entrepreneurial people who are skilled, who are willing to engage with the private sector, who are the private sector, whether formal or informal, I think it's an environment that businesses should be in.
I've been in GE for 38 years and in Nairobi for the last 7.5 years. And I think the thing that I'll miss the most is going to be the entrepreneurial, opportunistic, and optimistic nature of the African people. Every day, the next day is going to be a better day than today. And there's just a tremendous focus on the future and on growth and really making things better for everybody. And as you know, there's fits and starts as that happens, but fundamentally, that's what's happening in the last 7.5 years.
When you live and work in a continent like ours, what is important to understand is that it comes with extraordinary challenges which require a responsible approach. We have a responsibility, certainly on this continent, to transform people's lives. But there's nothing that is more satisfying in life than to have a young person come up to you, as I have often had, say, you know, I didn't have anybody to turn to. You send me to school. I have a degree. I have a family. And that's what we've all got to do.
When you're in Africa, you're not just doing business, you're touching lives. You're transforming societies. And you're really creating history. And this is the opportunity that anyone that goes to do business in Africa has today.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.